This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 3 Theosophy. When I was 10 years old, we changed over to a new and much bigger house which my father named
Anand Bhawan.
This house had a big garden and a swimming pool, and I was full of excitement at the fresh discoveries I was continually making. Additional buildings were put up, and there was a great deal of digging and construction, and I loved to watch the laborers at work. There was a large swimming pool in the house, and soon I learned to swim and felt completely at home in and under the water. During the long and hot summer days, I would go for a dip at all odd hours, many times a day. In the evening, many friends of my father's came to the pool. It was a novelty, and the electric light that had been installed there and in the house was an innovation for Allahabad in those days. I enjoyed myself hugely during these bathing parties, and an unfailing joy was to frighten, by pushing or pulling, those who did not know how to swim. I remember particularly
Dr. Tej Bahadur Sapru,
who was then a junior at the Allahabad bar. He knew no swimming and had no intention of learning it. He would sit on the first step in 15 inches of water, refusing absolutely to go forward even to the second step, and shouting loudly if anyone tried to move him. My father himself was no swimmer, but he could just manage to go the length of the pool with set teeth and violent and exhausting effort. The Boer War was then going on, and this interested me, and all my sympathies were with the Boers. I began to read the newspapers to get news of the fighting. A domestic event, however, just then absorbed my attention. This was the birth of a little sister. I had long nourished a secret grievance at not having any brothers or sisters when everybody else seemed to have them, and the prospect of having at last a baby brother or sister all to myself was exhilarating. Father was then in Europe. I remember waiting anxiously in the veranda for the event. One of the doctors came and told me of it, and added, presumably as a joke, that I must be glad that it was not a boy who would have taken a share in my patrimony. I felt bitter and angry at the thought that anyone should imagine that I could harbor such a vile notion. Father's visits to Europe led to an internal storm in the Kashmiri Brahmin community in India. He refused to perform any prayashchit or purification ceremony on his return. Some years previously, another Kashmiri Brahmin,
Pandit Bishan Narayan Dhar,
who later became a president of the Congress, had gone to England to be called to the bar. On his return, the orthodox members of the community had refused to have anything to do with him, and he was outcast, although he performed the prayashchit ceremony. This had resulted in the splitting up of the community into two more or less equal halves. Many Kashmiri young men went subsequently to Europe for their studies, and on their return joined the reformist section, but only after a formal ceremony of purification. This ceremony itself was a bit of a farce, and there was little of religion in it. It merely signified an outward conformity and a submission to the group will. Having done so, each person indulged in all manner of heterodox activities and mixed and fed with non-Brahmins and non-Hindus. Father went a step further and refused to go through any ceremony or to submit in any way, even outwardly and formally, to a so-called purification. A great deal of heat was generated, chiefly because of Father's aggressive and rather disdainful attitude, and ultimately a considerable number of Kashmiris joined Father, and so a third group was formed. Within a few years, these groups gradually merged into one another as ideas changed and the old restrictions fell. Large numbers of Kashmiri young men and girls have visited Europe or America for their studies, and no question has arisen of their performing any ceremonies on their return. Food restrictions have almost entirely gone, except in the case of a handful of orthodox people, chiefly old ladies, and interdining with non-Kashmiris Muslims and non-Indians is common.
Parda,
the seclusion of women, has disappeared among Kashmiris even as regards other communities. The last push to this was given by the political upheaval of 1930. Intermarriage with other communities is still not popular, although increasingly instances occur. Both my sisters have married non-Kashmiris, and a young member of our family has recently married a Hungarian girl. The objection to intermarriage with others is not based on religion, it is largely racial. There is a desire among many Kashmiris to preserve our group identity and our distinctive Aryan features, and a fear that we shall lose these in the sea of Indian and non-Indian humanity. We are small in numbers in this vast country. Probably the first Kashmiri Brahman in modern times to visit Western countries was Mirza Mohan Lal Kashmerian, as he called himself, about 100 years ago. He was a bright and handsome young man, a student of the Mission College at Delhi, and he was chosen to accompany a British mission to Kabul as Persian interpreter. Later, he travelled all over Central Asia and Persia, and wherever he went, he managed to take a new wife unto himself, usually marrying in the highest circles. He became a Muslim, and in Persia married a girl of the royal family, hence his title of Mirza. He visited Europe also, and was presented to the young Queen Victoria. He has written delightful memoirs and accounts of his travels. When I was about 11, a new resident tutor, Ferdinand T. Brooks, came and took charge of me. He was partly Irish on his father's side, and his mother had been a Frenchwoman or a Belgian. He was a keen theosophist who had been recommended to my father by Mrs. Annie Besant. For nearly 3 years he was with me, and in many ways he influenced me greatly. The only other tutor I had at the time was a dear old Pandit who was supposed to teach me Hindi and Sanskrit. After many years' effort, the Pandit managed to teach me extraordinarily little, so little that I can only measure my pitiful knowledge of Sanskrit with the Latin I learned subsequently at Harrow. The fault no doubt was mine. I am not good at languages, and grammar has had no attraction for me whatever. F.T. Brooks developed in me a taste for reading, and I read a great many English books, though rather aimlessly. I was well up in children's and boys' literature. The Lewis Carroll books were great favourites, and the Jungle Books and Kim. I was fascinated by Gustave Doré's illustrations to Don Quixote, and Fridtjof Nansen's Farthest North opened out a new realm of adventure to me. I remember reading many of the novels of Scott, Dickens, and Thackeray, H. G. Wells's romances, Mark Twain, and the Sherlock Holmes stories. I was thrilled by The Prisoner of Zenda, and Jerome K. Jerome's 3 Men in a Boat was for me the last word in humour. Another book stands out still in my memory. It was Du Maurier's Trilby, also Peter Ibbotson. I also developed a liking for poetry, a liking which has to some extent endured and survived the many other changes to which I have been subject. Brooks also initiated me into the mysteries of science. We rigged up a little laboratory, and there I used to spend long and interesting hours working out experiments in elementary physics and chemistry. Apart from my studies, F.T. Brooks brought a new influence to bear upon me, which affected me powerfully for a while. This was Theosophy. He used to have weekly meetings of Theosophists in his rooms, and I attended them, and gradually imbibed theosophical phraseology and ideas. There were metaphysical arguments and discussions about reincarnation and the astral and other supernatural bodies and auras and the doctrine of karma, and references not only to big books by Madame Blavatsky and other theosophists, but to the Hindu scriptures, the Buddhist Dhammapada, Pythagoras, Apollonius of Tyana, and various philosophers and mystics. I did not understand much that was said, but it all sounded very mysterious and fascinating, and I felt that here was the key to the secrets of the universe. For the first time I began to think, consciously and deliberately, of religion and other worlds. The Hindu religion especially went up in my estimation, not the ritual or ceremonial part, but its great books,
The Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita.
I did not understand them, of course, but they seemed very wonderful. I dreamt of astral bodies and imagined myself flying vast distances. This dream of flying high up in the air without any appliance has indeed been a frequent one throughout my life. and sometimes it has been vivid and realistic, and the countryside seemed to lie underneath me in a vast panorama. I do not know how the modern interpreters of dreams, Freud and others, would interpret this dream. Mrs. Annie Besant visited Allahabad in those days and delivered several addresses on theosophical subjects. I was deeply moved by her oratory and returned from her speeches dazed and as in a dream. I decided to join the Theosophical Society, although I was only 13 then. When I went to ask Father's permission, he laughingly gave it. He did not seem to attach importance to the subject either way. I was a little hurt by his lack of feeling. Great as he was in many ways in my eyes, I felt that he was lacking in spirituality. As a matter of fact, he was an old theosophist, having joined the society in its early days when Madame Blavatsky was in India. Curiosity probably led him to it more than religion, and he soon dropped out of it, but some of his friends who had joined with him persevered and rose high in the spiritual hierarchy of the society. So I became a member of the Theosophical Society at 13, and Mrs. Besant herself performed the ceremony of initiation, which consisted of good advice and instruction in some mysterious signs, probably a relic of Freemasonry. I was thrilled. I attended the Theosophical Convention at Benares and saw old Colonel Olcott with his fine beard. It is difficult to realize what one looked like or felt like in one's boyhood 30 years ago. But I have a fairly strong impression that during these theosophical days of mine I developed the flat and insipid look which sometimes denotes piety, and which is, or was, often to be seen among theosophist men and women. I was smug, with a feeling of being one of the elect, and altogether I must have been a thoroughly undesirable and unpleasant companion for any boy or girl of my age. Soon after F.T. Brooks left me, I lost touch with theosophy, and in a remarkably short time, partly because I went to school in England, theosophy left my life completely. But I have no doubt that those years with F.T. Brooks left a deep impress upon me, and I feel that I owe a debt to him and to theosophy. But I am afraid that theosophists have since then gone down in my estimation. Instead of the chosen ones, they seem to be very ordinary folk, liking security better than risk, a soft job more than the martyr's lot. But for Mrs. Besant, I always had the warmest admiration. The next important event that I remember affecting me was the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese victories stirred up my enthusiasm, and I waited eagerly for the papers for fresh news daily. I invested in a large number of books on Japan and tried to read some of them. I felt rather lost in Japanese history, but I liked the knightly tales of old Japan and the pleasant prose of Lafcadio Hearn. Nationalistic ideas filled my mind. I mused of Indian freedom and Asiatic freedom from the thraldom of Europe. I dreamt of brave deeds, of how, sword in hand, I would fight for India and help in freeing her. I was 14. Changes were taking place in our house. My older cousins, having become professional men, were leaving the common home and setting up their own households separately. Fresh thoughts and vague fancies were floating in my mind, and I began to take a little more interest in the opposite sex. I still preferred the company of boys, and thought it a little beneath my dignity to mix with groups of girls. But sometimes at Kashmiri parties, where pretty girls were not lacking, or elsewhere, a glance or a touch would thrill me. In May 1905, when I was 15, we set sail for England. Father and mother, my baby sister and I, we all went together. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Harrow and Cambridge. On a May day, towards the end of the month, we reached London, reading in the train from Dover of the great Japanese sea victory at Tsushima. I was in high good humour. The very next day happened to be Derby Day, and we went to see the race. I remember meeting, soon after our arrival in London, M.A. Ansari, who was then a smart and clever young man with a record of brilliant academical achievement behind him. He was a house surgeon at the time in a London hospital. I was a little fortunate in finding a vacancy at Harrow, for I was slightly above the usual age for entry, being 15. My family went to the continent, and after some months they returned to India. Never before had I been left among strangers all by myself, and I felt lonely and homesick, but not for long. I managed to fit in to some extent in the life at school, and work and play kept me busy. I was never an exact fit. Always I had a feeling that I was not one of them, and the others must have felt the same way about me. I was left a little to myself, but on the whole I took my full share in the games, without in any way shining at them, and it was, I believe, recognized that I was no shirker. I was put, to begin with, in a low form because of my small knowledge of Latin, but I was pushed higher up soon. In many subjects probably, and especially in general knowledge, I was in advance of those of my age. My interests were certainly wider, and I read both books and newspapers more than most of my fellow students. I remember writing to my father how dull most of the English boys were, as they could talk about nothing but their games. But there were exceptions, especially when I reached the upper forms. I was greatly interested in the general election, which took place, as far as I remember, at the end of 1905, and which ended in a great Liberal victory. Early in 1906 our form master asked us about the new government, and much to his surprise, I was the only boy in his form who could give him much information on the subject, including almost a complete list of members of Campbell Bannerman's cabinet. Apart from politics, another subject that fascinated me was the early growth of aviation. Those were the days of the Wright brothers and Santos Dumont, to be followed soon by Farman, Latham and Blériot. And I wrote to father from Harrow in my enthusiasm that soon I might be able to pay him a weekend visit in India by air. There were 4 or 5 Indian boys at Harrow in my time. I seldom came across those at other houses, but in our own house, the headmaster's, we had one of the sons of
Gaekwads of Baroda.
He was much senior to me and was popular because of his cricket. He left soon after my arrival. Later came the eldest son of the Maharaja of Kapurthala,
Paramjit Singh, now the Tikka Sahab.
He was a complete misfit and was unhappy and could not mix at all with the other boys, who often made fun of him and his ways. This irritated him greatly, and sometimes he used to tell them what he would do to them if they came to Kapurthala. Needless to say, this did not improve matters for him. He had previously spent some time in France and could speak French fluently, but oddly enough, such were the methods of teaching foreign languages in English public schools that this hardly helped him in the French classes. A curious incident took place once when in the middle of the night the housemaster suddenly visited our rooms and made a thorough search all over the house. We learnt that Paramjit Singh had lost his beautiful gold-mounted cane. The search was not successful. 2 or 3 days later, the Eton and Harrow match took place at Lord's, and immediately afterwards the cane was discovered in the owner's room. Evidently someone had used it at Lord's and then returned it. There were a few Jews in our house and in other houses. They got on fairly well, but there was always a background of anti-Semitic feeling. They were the damned Jews, and soon, almost unconsciously, I began to think that it was the proper thing to have this feeling. I never really felt anti-Semitic in the least, and in later years I had many good friends among the Jews. I got used to Harrow and liked the place, and yet somehow I began to feel that I was outgrowing it. The university attracted me. Right through the years 1906 and 1907, news from India had been agitating me. I got meagre enough accounts from the English papers. But even that little showed that big events were happening at home, in Bengal,
Punjab,
and the Maharashtra. There was Lala Lajpat Rai's and S. Ajit Singh's deportation, and Bengal seemed to be in an uproar, and Tilak's name was often flashed from Pune, and there was Swadeshi and boycott. All this stirred me tremendously, but there was not a soul in Harrow to whom I could talk about it. During the holidays I met some of my cousins or other Indian friends and then had a chance of relieving my mind. A prize I got for good work at school was one of G. M. Trevelyan's Garibaldi books. This fascinated me, and soon I obtained the other 2 volumes of the series and studied the whole Garibaldi story in them carefully. Visions of similar deeds in India came before me, of a gallant fight for freedom, and in my mind India and Italy got strangely mixed together. Harrow seemed a rather small and restricted place for these ideas, and I wanted to go to the wider sphere of the university. So I induced father to agree to this and left Harrow after only 2 years' stay, which was much less than the usual period. I was leaving Harrow because I wanted to do so myself, and yet I well remember that when the time came to part I felt unhappy and tears came to my eyes. I had grown rather fond of the place, and my departure for good put an end to one period in my life. And yet I wonder how far I was really sorry at leaving Harrow. Was it not partly a feeling that I ought to be unhappy, because Harrow tradition and song demanded it? I was susceptible to these traditions, for I had deliberately not resisted them so as to be in harmony with the place. Cambridge, Trinity College, the beginning of October 1907, my age 17, or rather approaching 18. I felt elated at being an undergraduate with a great deal of freedom compared to school to do what I chose. I had got out of the shackles of boyhood and felt at last that I could claim to be a grown-up. With a self-conscious air I wandered about the big courts and narrow streets of Cambridge, delighted to meet a person I knew. 3 years I was at Cambridge, 3 quiet years with little of disturbance in them, moving slowly on like the sluggish Cam. They were pleasant years, with many friends and some work and some play, and a gradual widening of the intellectual horizon. I took the natural sciences tripos, my subjects being chemistry, geology, and botany, but my interests were not confined to these. Many of the people I met at Cambridge or during the vacations in London or elsewhere talked learnedly about books and literature and history and politics and economics. I felt a little at sea at first in this semi-highbrow talk, but I read a few books and soon got the hang of it, and could at least keep my end up and not betray too great an ignorance on any of the usual subjects. So we discussed Nietzsche, he was all the rage in Cambridge then, and Bernard Shaw's prefaces, and the latest book by Lowes Dickinson. We considered ourselves very sophisticated, and talked of sex and morality in a superior way, referring casually to Ivan Bloch, Havelock Ellis, Krafft Ebing, or Otto Weininger. We felt that we knew about as much of the theory of the subject as anyone who was not a specialist need know. As a matter of fact, in spite of our brave talk, most of us were rather timid where sex was concerned. At any rate I was so, and my knowledge for many years, till after I had left Cambridge, remained confined to theory. Why this was so it is a little difficult to say. Most of us were strongly attracted by sex, and I doubt if any of us attached any idea of sin to it. Certainly I did not. There was no religious inhibition. We talked of its being amoral, neither moral nor immoral. Yet in spite of all this, a certain shyness kept me away, as well as a distaste for the usual methods adopted. For I was in those days definitely a shy lad, perhaps because of my lonely childhood. My general attitude to life at the time was a vague kind of Cyrenaicism, partly natural to youth, partly the influence of Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater. It is easy and gratifying to give a long Greek name to the desire for a soft life and pleasant experiences. But there was something more in it than that, for I was not particularly attracted to a soft life. Not having the religious temper and disliking the repressions of religion, it was natural for me to seek some other standard. I was superficial and did not go deep down into anything. And so the aesthetic side of life appealed to me, and the idea of going through life worthily, not indulging it in the vulgar way, but still making the most of it and living a full and many-sided life attracted me. I enjoyed life, and I refused to see why I should consider it a thing of sin. At the same time, risk and adventure fascinated me. I was always, like my father, a bit of a gambler, at first with money and then for higher stakes, with the bigger issues of life. Indian politics in 1907 and 1908 were in a state of upheaval, and I wanted to play a brave part in them, and this was not likely to lead to a soft life. All these mixed and sometimes conflicting desires led to a medley in my mind. Vague and confused it was, but I did not worry, for the time for any decision was yet far distant. Meanwhile, life was pleasant, both physically and intellectually. Fresh horizons were ever coming into sight. There was so much to be done, so much to be seen, so many fresh avenues to explore. And we would sit by the fireside in the long winter evenings and talk and discuss unhurriedly deep into the night till the dying fire drove us shivering to our beds. And sometimes during our discussions our voices would lose their even tenor and would grow loud and excited in heated arguments. But it was all make-believe. We played with the problems of human life in a mock-serious way, for they had not become real problems for us yet, and we had not been caught in the coils of the world's affairs. It was the pre-war world of the early 20th century. Soon this world was to die, yielding place to another, foil of death and destruction and anguish and heart-sickness for the world's youth. But the veil of the future hid this, and we saw around us an assured and advancing order of things, and this was pleasant for those who could afford it. I write of Cyrenaicism and the like, and of various ideas that influenced me then. But it would be wrong to imagine that I thought clearly on these subjects then, or even that I thought it necessary to try to be clear and definite about them. They were just vague fancies that floated in my mind, and in this process left their impress in a greater or less degree. I did not worry myself at all about these speculations. Work and games and amusements filled my life, and the only thing that disturbed me sometimes was the political struggle in India. Among the books that influenced me politically at Cambridge was Meredith Townsend's Asia and Europe. From 1907 onwards, for several years, India was seething with unrest and trouble. For the first time since the revolt of 1857, India was showing fight and not submitting tamely to foreign rule.
News of Tilak's activities and his conviction of Aurobindo Ghosh and the way the masses of Bengal were taking the Swadeshi
and boycott pledge stirred all of us Indians in England. Almost without an exception, we were Tilakites or extremists, as the new party was called in India. The Indians in Cambridge had a society called the Majlis. We discussed political problems there often, but in somewhat unreal debates. More effort was spent in copying parliamentary and the university union style and mannerisms than in grappling with the subject. Frequently I went to the Majlis, but during my 3 years I hardly spoke there. I could not get over my shyness and diffidence. This same difficulty pursued me in my college debating society, the Magpie and Stump, where there was a rule that a member not speaking for a whole term had to pay a fine. Often I paid the fine. In the Majlis and in private talks, Indian students often used the most extreme language when discussing Indian politics. They even talked in terms of admiration of the acts of violence that were then beginning in Bengal. Later, I was to find that these very persons were to become members of the Indian civil service, high court judges, very staid and sober lawyers, and the like. Few of these parlour firebrands took any effective part in Indian political movements subsequently. Some of the noted Indian politicians of the day visited us at Cambridge. We respected them, but there was also a trace of superiority in our attitude. We felt that ours was a wider culture, and we could take a broader view of things. Among those who came to us were
Bipin Chandra Pal, Lajpat Rai and G.K. Gokhale.
We met Bipin Pal in one of our sitting rooms. There were only a dozen of us present, but he thundered at us as if he was addressing a mass meeting of 10,000. The volume of noise was so terrific that I could hardly follow what he was saying. Lalaji spoke to us in a more reasonable way, and I was impressed by his talk. I wrote to father that I preferred Lalaji's address to Bipin Pal's, and this pleased him, for he had no liking in those days for the firebrands of Bengal. Gokhale addressed a public meeting in Cambridge, and my chief recollection of this meeting is of a question that was put by A.M. Khwaja at the end of it. Khwaja got up from the body of the hall and put an interminable question, which went on, till most of us had forgotten how it began and what it was about.
Hardayal
had a great reputation among the Indians, but he was at Oxford a little before my time at Cambridge. I met him once or twice in London during my Harrow days. Among my contemporaries at Cambridge, there were several who played a prominent part in Indian Congress politics in later years. J. M. Sengupta left Cambridge soon after I went up. Saif Uddin Kichlu, Syed Mahmud, and Tasadduq Ahmad Shawani were more or less my contemporaries. S. M. Sulaiman, who is now the Chief Justice of the Allahabad High Court, was also at Cambridge in my time. Other contemporaries have blossomed out as ministers and members of the Indian civil service. In London, we used to hear also of Shyamji Krishan Varma and his India House, but I never met him or visited that house. Sometimes we saw his Indian sociologist. Long afterwards, in 1926, I saw Shyamji in Geneva. His pockets still bulged with ancient copies of the Indian sociologist, and he regarded almost every Indian who came near him as a spy sent by the British government. In London also there was the Student Centre opened by the India Office. This was universally regarded by Indians, with a great deal of justification, as a device to spy on Indian students. Many Indians, however, had to put up with it, whether they wanted to or not, as it became almost impossible to enter a university without its recommendation. The political situation in India had drawn my father into more active politics, and I was pleased at this, although I did not agree with his politics. He had, naturally enough, joined the moderates whom he knew, and many of whom were his colleagues in his profession. He presided over a provincial conference in his province and took up a strong line against the extremists of Bengal and Maharashtra. He also became president of the UP Provincial Congress Committee. He was present at Surat in 1907 when the Congress broke up in disorder and later emerged as a purely moderate group. Soon after Surat, H. W. Nevinson stopped with him at Allahabad as his guest for a while, and in his book on India, he referred to father as being moderate in everything except his generosity. This was a very wrong estimate, for father was never moderate in anything except his politics, and step by step his nature drove him from even that remnant of moderation. A man of strong feelings, strong passions, tremendous pride, and great strength of will, he was very far from the moderate type. And yet in 1907 and 1908, and for some years afterwards, he was undoubtedly a moderate of moderates, and he was bitter against the extremists, though I believe he admired Tilak. Why was this so? It was natural for him, with his grounding in law and constitutionalism, to take a lawyer's and a constitutional view of politics. His clear thinking led him to see that hard and extreme words lead nowhere unless they are followed by action appropriate to the language. He saw no effective action in prospect. The Swadeshi and boycott movements did not seem to him to carry matters far. And then the background of these movements was a religious nationalism which was alien to his nature. He did not look back to a revival in India of ancient times. He had no sympathy or understanding of them, and utterly disliked many old social customs, caste and the like, which he considered reactionary. He looked to the West and felt greatly attracted by Western progress, and thought that this could come through an association with England. Socially speaking, the revival of Indian nationalism in 1907 was definitely reactionary. Inevitably, a new nationalism in India, as elsewhere in the East, was a religious nationalism. The moderates thus represented a more advanced social outlook, but they were a mere handful on the top, with no touch with the masses. They did not think much in terms of economics, except in terms of the new upper middle class, which they partly represented, and which wanted room for expansion. They advocated also petty social reforms to weaken caste and do away with old social customs which hindered growth. Having cast his lot with the moderates, father took an aggressive line. Most of the extremists, apart from a few leaders in Bengal and Pune, were young men, and it irritated him to find that these youngsters dared to go their own way. Impatient and intolerant of opposition, and not suffering people whom he considered fools, gladly He pitched into them and hid out whenever he could. I remember, I think it was after I left Cambridge, reading an article of his which annoyed me greatly. I wrote him rather an impertinent letter in which I suggested that no doubt the British government was greatly pleased with his political activities. This was just the kind of suggestion which would make him wild, and he was very angry. He almost thought of asking me to return from England immediately. During my stay at Cambridge, the question had arisen as to what career I should take up. For a little while the Indian civil service was contemplated. There was a glamour about it still in those days. But this idea was dropped as neither my father nor I were keen on it. The principal reason, I think, was that I was still under age for it, and if I was to appear for it, I would have to stay 3 to 4 years more after taking my degree. I was 20 when I took my degree at Cambridge, and the age limit for the ICS in those days was 22 to 34. If successful, an extra year had to be spent in England. My people were a little tired of my long stay in England and wanted me back soon. Another reason which weighed with father was that in case I was appointed to the ICS, I would be posted in various distant places far from home. Both father and mother wanted me near them after my long absence. So the die was cast in favour of the paternal profession, the bar, and I joined the Inner Temple. It is curious that in spite of my growing extremism in politics, I did not then view with any strong disfavour the idea of joining the ICS and thus becoming a cog in the British government's administrative machine in India. Such an idea in later years would have been repellent to me. I left Cambridge after taking my degree in 1910. I was only moderately successful in my science tripos examination, obtaining second-class honours. For the next 2 years I hovered about London. My law studies did not take up much time, and I got through the bar examinations, one after the other, with neither glory nor ignominy. For the rest, I simply drifted, doing some general reading, vaguely attracted to the Fabians and socialistic ideas, and interested in the political movements of the day. Ireland and the woman suffrage movement interested me especially. I remember also how, during a visit to Ireland in the summer of 1910, the early beginnings of Sinn Féin had attracted me. I came across some old Harrow friends and developed expensive habits in their company. Often I exceeded the handsome allowance that father made me, and he was greatly worried on my account, fearing that I was rapidly going to the devil. But as a matter of fact, I was not doing anything so notable. I was merely trying to ape to some extent the prosperous but somewhat empty-headed Englishman who is called a man about town. This soft and pointless existence, needless to say, did not improve me in any way. My early enthusiasms began to tone down, and the only thing that seemed to go up was my conceit. During my vacations I had sometimes travelled on the continent. In the summer of 1909 my father and I happened to be in Berlin when Count Zeppelin arrived, flying in his new airship from Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance. I believe that was his first long flight, and the occasion was celebrated by a huge demonstration and a formal welcome by the Kaiser. A vast multitude, estimated at between 1 and 2 millions, gathered in the Tempelhof field in Berlin, and the Zeppelin arrived to time and circled gracefully above us. The Hotel Adlon presented all its residents that day with a fine picture of Count Zeppelin, and I have still got that picture. About 2 months later we saw in Paris the first airplane to fly all over the city and to circle round the Eiffel Tower. The aviator's name was, I think, Comte de Lambert. 18 years later I was again in Paris when Lindbergh came like a shining arrow from across the Atlantic. I had a narrow escape once in Norway, where I had gone on a pleasure cruise soon after taking my degree at Cambridge in 1910. We were tramping across the mountainous country. Hot and weary we reached our destination, a little hotel, and demanded baths. Such a thing had not been heard of there, and there was no provision for it in the building. We were told, however, that we could wash ourselves in a neighbouring stream. So, armed with table napkins or perhaps small face towels, which the hotel generously gave, 2 of us, a young Englishman and I, went to this roaring torrent which was coming from a glacier nearby. I entered the water. It was not deep, but it was freezing, and the bottom was terribly slippery. I slipped and fell, and the ice-cold water numbed me and made me lose all sensation or power of controlling my limbs. I could not regain my foothold and was swept rapidly along by the torrent. My companion, the Englishman, however, managed to get out, and he ran along the side, and ultimately, succeeding in catching my leg, dragged me out. Later, we realized the danger we were in, for about 200 or 300 yards ahead of us, this mountain torrent tumbled over an enormous precipice, forming a waterfall which was one of the sights of the place. In the summer of 1913, I was called to the bar, and in the autumn of that year I returned to India finally, after a stay of over 7 years in England. Twice in between I had gone home during my holidays, but now I returned for good, and I am afraid, as I landed at Bombay, I was a bit of a prig with little to commend me. End of chapter 4.